Hi, my name is Tommy Henry, and I'm the host of the Chicago History Podcast.
And I am Kelly Marshall, the founder of Chicago Movie Tours.
Together, we're discussing Backdraft, the Ron Howard-directed film shot here in Chicago about firefighters, which was released 30 years ago this month, on May 24th, 1991. Joining Kelly and me is the screenwriter of not only the original Backdraft, but Backdraft 2, Highlander, The Prophecy, and more. Gregory Widen, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I've read a little bit about you, but for people who don't know much about you, please share with us a little bit of your backstory. Where did you grow up? And do you remember what you wanted to be when you were a kid, when you grew up?
Oh, I grew up in Laguna Beach, California, which is about halfway between LA and San Diego. I didn't have any background in firefighting or really much of an interest in it when I was a kid. We had tours of firehouses and I was like, yeah. And I wanted to be an oceanographer and I wanted to be a lot of other things, but I also wrote short stories my entire life since I was a little kid. So clearly I was headed that way. I was a firefighter for a while. And the reason I ended up that way was I thought I wanted to be a doctor. And so while I was still in high school, I got a paramedic certificate, which is kind of an odd thing to do at that age. I kind of went to night school for a year. And when I graduated, I got accepted into UCLA film, and I needed to pay for it. And so I went out and randomly I knew the fire department a little bit because they had sponsored a mountain rescue team that I was a part of when I was a teenager in Laguna. And we used to go out and get people trapped on cliffs and things. And so I hung out at the fire station and they sponsored us and I knew the guys and I knew the world. And on a lark, I just took the test, the firefighter test when I was in college. And I think largely because of my paramedic background, they hired me. And I was only 18, which is really young. Next youngest guy in my battalion was 27. So I was like definitely the kid. And I did that while I went to film school. And it was a very odd life, you work a 24-hour shift. So when you get off, I would rush to class to make like cinematography class or whatever. And I remember there was a girl that sat next to me and she would lean over and smell my hair and see if I'd been in a fire because you never quite get all the smell out of it. And I worked in that job for a certain number of years. And then I sold Highlander, which was the first movie I did. It was a class project at UCLA. And then I kind of went on from there, stuff that got made, stuff that didn't get made, but I got paid to do, and it became a life, and and went on. And eventually, when I was still in my 20s, I wrote Backdraft, and then we did that in Chicago, which was really fun because I actually wrote it for Chicago. So that was
well, and that's one of the questions. I'm a big Highlander fan, and I got to say, as a class project to get made into a film with Sean Connery, that's a pretty cool class project.
I got a name. Yeah, I got a name.
Nice,
and a house.
Nice. And a house. So, for the listeners, I've read about this. I think Kelly has as well. What was the inspiration for Backdraft?
I wanted to do a firefighter story, and I mean, when you say the inspiration, the inspiration to do a firefighter movie was I'd been a firefighter, and I just thought there was more to tell than I'd ever seen. You never really see it. There really hadn't been a firefighter motion picture at that point. There was shows like Emergency and things, but I really wanted to tell that story. Why it was that specific plot was, one of the inherent problems of telling a story about firefighters is the same problem you would tell about telling a story, say, about a patrolman, which is it tends to be just a lot of calls, one after the other, disconnected from one another. And all you're left with is kind of the drama in between the calls, which kind of spices things up. And so that's why I kind of leaned into the arson investigation side of it, which I had some familiar with. When I worked, I happened to be on the worst fire in LA history in terms of loss of life. And, I met with the arson investigators and I knew them and always stayed with me. And so I kind of put that into the story, and that's kind of how that got going. And why it's Chicago was I was really trying to differ, because even though my firefighting experience was out in Southern California, I wanted to differentiate it from shows like Emergency, which was LA County Fire, and place it in an environment that was completely different, you know, and not New York, because I felt like there was a lot of New York stuff. So I thought, oh, maybe I didn't really know anything about Chicago. I just wrote and said, hey, can I come ride with you guys? And they kind of, you know, I'm a fireman. I just stopped being a fireman. So I was kind of, figured I knew my way around Bernie things, you know. So they brought me out, and Chicago being Chicago, they just, you know, threw me in the middle of fires and dragged me around, just let me do whatever I want. I mean, I had one moment, there was a great arson investigator I met named Rimgale is his last name, and he just passed away recently. But he, and in some way, Robert De Niro's character is based on it. I had to change it in the script when De Niro was cast, because of course the real Rimgale was like 6'4", and De Niro's not, you know. But he took me, you know, and I think he was just trying to impress me, you know, the West Coast guy or something. But he took me. We got a call, and it was a bus barn that was burning, where they stored all these school buses, and the regular units hadn't gotten there yet. He was an arson investigator. So we pull up in his Crown Vic, and he goes, well, let's go in, see what's going on, you know. And we didn't have air tanks or anything, you know. We just go in, and we're going deeper and deeper into the fire, and it's getting smokier and smokier and smokier. And I'm starting to feel like, you know, my eyes are running, and like somebody's taking a claw hammer in my lungs. And I'm just about the point where I can't take it anymore. And he turns around, lights a cigarette.
Oh
And I was like, okay, you win, you know. So we had to find our way out because we got lost, and you could hear the school buses exploding and the building rocking from the explosions. Wow. We finally got out, and like 10 minutes later, the whole thing collapsed. You know? But and I remember, you know, it was a different time too. You know, Cabrini Green was still around, and there was a fire in Cabrini Green. I remember he took me along, and of course the elevators never worked there, and so we're going up the stairs, you know, one flight after another. And we get kind of to the top, and half the lights are burned out, and there's some spooky guys with guns. And he just doesn't even enter the floor. He stays on the staircase, and he goes, undetermined. was his pull in the fire. And then he turned around and left, you know.
You got quite the Chicago experience.
Yeah,
you
you know,
got to see bus barns and Cabrini Green,
I mean, they're busy there, you know, and it was also the first time I'd ever seen a big city in snow. It was interesting.
yeah.
I've been to ski resorts, but I'd never seen a big city in snow, because I was probably 24 or something when I went to research it, and I really fell in love with it. It's something I didn't necessarily have in my mind when I started thinking about it, but what I came with it was the whole traditional side of the fire department. You know, the irony is that, you know, LA, which has kind of a reputation as a city of being kind of more laid back and easygoing or whatever, the fire department's like the Marine Corps. I mean, when I went to work, if I had the wrong color socks on, they'd send you home. I mean, there was just, everything was incredibly by the book. And it really was like the Marine Corps, but in places like Chicago, it's like, if you had something on you that said Chicago Fire Department, you know, you're okay. And it was just, there was a lot of tradition. Guys kind of just wouldn't listen to the safety rules. You know, there was one captain that was famous, I guess, particularly in that era. He wouldn't button his coat, you know, because that was too cool, not cool to buckle it, or he wouldn't get on his knees in a fire. You know, the difference between the ceiling and the floor in a fire can be 800 degrees, you know, and he wouldn't but, you know, get on his knees in a fire. Like, this is his thing, you know, and you get fired in LA.
Yeah.
And I kind of fell in love with that. You know, they had a saying in the Chicago Fire Department, it was 150 years of tradition unimpeded by progress. And I liked that, you know, and so I think that I sort of fell in love with the department and the style. And usually the best way to write something, particularly something, you know, is to use what you know enough to give it a sense of verisimilitude and reality, so people feel like, oh, this person, feel they're in the hands of someone who, you know, gets the basics right, but then set it in a slightly alien place from what you know, so that you have the freedom to invent, and you're not constantly caught up in the minutia of what's true. You know, I mean, my great lesson of that for me was Jean Le Carré's books, you know, because he was an actual MI6 guy, but he wrote those Smiley books like Tinker Tinker Soldier Spy and Smiley's People. He obviously knew how MI6 worked, but it made it so that he would get the details right, like people, you know, did their trade craft correctly, but the actual institution they work for, you could kind of invent and, you know, and kind of mess with, and, you know, and trick you that way. And so I tried to do the same thing, because that was always an inspiration for me, where, you know, nobody holds a handline wrong in Backdraft, and nobody, you know, everybody uses a pipe pull correctly, and they all use the right radio lingo and all the rest of it. But, you know, I mess with the reality of the Chicago Fire Department. I mean, it seems like there's 4 fire engines in that movie, because you kind of, because you want to keep it local, and
Sure.
and things are a lot smaller, more intimate than would be in real life, and blah 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 blah, and so I felt free to invent it. And so I probably wandered off here from your question, but
No. That was great. I think Kelly's got some follow up for you.
No, that was good because you're transitioning from actual experience to how you place that into a screenplay. And that was my next
Right.
question for you, which
Right.
is when most screenwriters hand over a screenplay, it no longer belongs to them. But was that the case
Sure.
with you in Backdraft? I mean,
Yes.
how much of the filmmaking process were you a part of, if at all?
Oh, I was actually fortunate on Backdraft where I think maybe because I used to be a fireman, or maybe I just got along with Ron well. But when we actually did the movie, I was on the set the whole time. It was 112 shooting days, and I was there for the whole shoot in Chicago. And and I think he just liked having me around. I'd be there for every rehearsal. And I think there was one day I wasn't there, and I got an angry phone call because there was something they wanted to. Because part of the problem was, and I think one of the reasons they liked having me around was that they had plenty of fire department advisors there. They could ask 10 fire department guys they'd hired, what hose do you pick up for this? But I think I'd created a kind of slightly magic realism version of the fire department a little bit on purpose. And so they would kind of get caught where like, was this something our department would do, in this moment, or was this something that's the vibe of it and the way because they talk about things in much more poetic terms sometimes than probably they do in real life. And so they'd want me around for that, for sure. I think I represented a vibe that they wanted more than actual technical knowledge, because obviously I wasn't a Chicago fireman. I was a Southern California fireman, and but they had plenty of guys who knew that stuff. But I had kind of a particular vision of it. So, and I got along, and I knew what to say and what not to say, and who was in charge of the movie at this point, and and Ron Howard was a very collaborative guy. He understood. Some directors are threatened by writers. I mean, some writers misbehave and they're like, no, you can't, but he also understood that, any good ideas are going to be credited to him, and
Did he call on you to do rewrites at all? On set? Okay.
Yeah. There were yes, there were. I remember especially when Donald Sutherland came in. He had a lot of notes, and so I think I was locked in a trailer with Donald Sutherland for about 2 days to do his work on his giant monologue he had. Funny side story to that. There's a thing in filmmaking called looping, which is when if the sound you record was too noisy, which it very often was in Backdraft because of the effects and everything, you would have to go in a studio later and re-record the dialogue for that scene. And usually that's done where they run the bit of film over and over again, and you do like a sentence at a time, and I go beep beep beep, and you say the line, beep beep, say the line. I actually had to do that because I have a part in the movie. And Ron had committed to his next movie very quickly after Backdraft, and he couldn't even finish all the post on it. He went off to do Far and Away. And so I was left actually to do the looping for the movie. So I directed the actors for the looping, like De Niro and those guys, when they came in, and I did Sutherland. And the thing that was amazing about Sutherland, I'd never seen this before, rather than doing one line at a time, he would take the entire scene and then he'd have the editor put grease marks, because it's still film, but they would do grease marks, and the grease marks would travel along in parallel during the scene, and they would come together at every syllable to mark a syllable. And he sat there and he did a 3-minute monologue in one take, looping it. Wow. It was perfect. I was just astounded by that. I was like, wow, that's amazing.
You spent some time in Chicago. I'm curious as to what your memories are from back then. Did you get out in the town? Did you get to see much?
Oh, yeah. One of the great things about working on a movie like we were in Chicago was that I had the most free time of anybody, because they wanted me there. I had to be there in the morning for all the rehearsals, but I didn't have to be there all day, and I didn't have to be there, so I was the one getting sleep, and I was the one that could kind of go out at night. And we were the big movie in Chicago at that point. There wasn't really anybody else shooting, and we everyone knew who we were, and you could kind of walk into any restaurant. And I remember there was a CNN reporter, and she'd come to do an interview, and she said, "Let's go get something to eat." And I said, "Okay." And she goes, "Well, there's this place at the time this very hot restaurant called Scoozy, you know, and she said, let's go to Scoozy. And I said, oh, well, you know, there's a huge line there. I mean, it's impossible to get in there. And she goes, well, let's just try, you know. So we go, and I'm ready to just get at the back of the line. She goes, no, let me talk to them. So she talks to them. She goes back, and the guy comes out, oh, please come right in, you know. And we go in and we sit down. So I'm sitting here having dinner, and I'm going like, this is amazing, you know. I'm having a great time in Chicago. I'm in Scoozy. I'm sitting having dinner with you in Scoozy. And you know, it's amazing that you did this. She goes, well, I used your name.
Wow.
Now, not that my name meant anything, but she said the writer of the movie.
The writer of
shooting
Backdraft,
here.
sure.
And boom,
Yeah.
it was in. I was like, oh, it didn't even occur to me to do that. Okay. But that was kind of what life was like at that point. So I went out to a ton of great restaurants. I mean, I could name names of places that don't mean anything to anybody. There was a fun coffee house called Sweet Bean that was up kind of a Russian division meat. That was famous for having models serve the coffees. So of course, Kurt Russell and everybody was there constantly. And there was a club called Cairo, which was over a bit west of the near north, that everyone hung out and danced at. And you know, it's a very different place because, you know, it's funny. A lot of the places that we shot, I've been back to Chicago since. You know, I went to recently went to Next and the restaurant over there, or the bar, then the attached restaurant, and before COVID. And it was weird seeing the West Loop now, because that's where we shot a lot of Backdraft, those old giant printing buildings that they were tearing down west of the river. And going back there now, and it's this hip neighborhood, and, you know, because it was just a wasteland,
Yeah,
you know, when we were shooting that. So.
Yeah, wildly different now. When you look at, you know, even if you look at Google Maps now, you can go back like 5 years, and what used to be a parking lot or like a closed down bank is now this, you know, glass monolith. So
yeah, it's crazy. Oh, also the near north where I was living, because I lived on Ohio and State, Erie and State, in a kind of corporate apartment there. And I go walking back that neighborhood now, the number of residential high rises that have been built in that neighborhood are just like, wow, you know.
Well, I guess with 112 shooting days, yeah, you had to get a corporate apartment, I guess. That's
And remember, we're only shooting 5 days a week.
Oh, right.
So,
And
so
2
we were
days
there
off.
6 months. So we were
Well,
just there
it's good
6
that,
months.
you know, you weren't stuck hammering away at the screenplay in your off days as well. You were able to kind of get out. Now, speaking of the script, did you have actors in mind for the roles as you were writing? Like, I read, you know, Sean Connery was up for the De Niro role, and Dennis Quaid was mentioned for the role that went to Kurt Russell. When you were writing, did you have like the hot actors of the time in mind, or were you just writing characters?
No, you know, I'm really bad at that. I think in my head, oddly enough, I wrote, because he looked like the real Rimgale, I wrote, it's going to sound strange, but I wrote the Rimgale character as Brian Dennehy, because I just saw him as a big guy.
That would have been amazing. You know? Yeah.
And of course, who's going to say no to De Niro wanting to do it? But that was, but that's what I had in mind, because the real guy is just this, you know, giant piece of hammered beef. It looks like a refrigerator, you know, kind of a craggy face, and I just, you know, and so I was just vamping off that, and so that was probably the only character I had a visual for, which was Brian Dennehy. Yeah. So.
Now, when they cast Jason Gedrick, pretty boy Jason Gedrick, in the Tim Krasminski role, were you kind of happy knowing that the prettiest kid in the cast was going to be the one disfigured horribly in the fire?
I never thought about that. It's interesting, though. He was shooting that scene, and his wife gave birth, and so he had to run from the set with his burn makeup on.
That's so
go
funny.
to the maternity ward because his wife was giving birth. I remember that.
Well, yeah, Chicago born. Hopefully, he had, you know, some family in the area. So you know, it was funny watching this as I did. And by the way, not to completely out myself as a nerd, it's true. The Backdraft Laserdisc is part of my collection. But
wow, you have a Laserdisc.
Watching Kurt Russell from 30 years ago, you know how Marvel movies have the de-aging process. Right. That's what I mean, he looks like, oh my gosh, like he looks like just a kid there, you know. Yeah,
he's 30. What is he? 39.
Wow.
At that point when we did the movie.
Yeah,
so,
younger than you and I are.
I think you froze him on the Zoom. Yeah. Yeah, he was young, you know, and he was great too. he's a powerful personality, you know, but he decided when he made the decision to do the movie, like the first day of the movie, do it. He really brought along a lot of people, because what makes Backdraft unusual as a movie, and one reason I think it survived, one of the reasons that it survived as kind of a favorite movie you still see on TV all the time, is that there's almost no CGI in it. There's one CGI shot in the entire film, which is when Billy turns around and sees the monster kind of loom up the fire like a monster.
Sure.
One shot. The
It's
rest of the
tough to
movie's
make-
all practical.
Yeah.
Yeah, the whole rest of the movie's practical. And so what that meant was it was incredibly uncomfortable for the actors. I mean, we had a machine we called the Ashomatic, which was actually my idea, because of my pet peeve with fire department, still today, fire department movies, is that there's never any flotsam in the air. You know, it's just clean flame. And I was always advocating making it dirtier, make it dirtier. And so we had a machine that would blow embers into the swirling in the air. And of course, they're wearing this gel to protect their face from getting burned, and you know, the embers would hit the gel and
Kind of stay
and it's
there.
also Chicago summer, and you're wearing a turnout coat, and you know, it could have gone either way with some of the actors starting to whine and not being great. But Kurt was like, no, doing it, and no one ended up complaining because they knew they'd look bad because Kurt was doing it, you know. So that really
he
that
comes
helped out a
across like
lot.
the kind of guy who would have wanted to train for 8 weeks
He did.
before the movie started.
Yeah, they went out. I don't know if it was 8 weeks, but they took a mini little academy, and they, you know, for maybe a week, and then they also rode it with some fire stations and stuff, and just so they knew what they were doing. I mean, Robert De Niro was really obsessed about his equipment. It's kind of the way he works. It's interesting when you work with him. It's all about what am I grabbing and why, and where does it go. That's before he talks about acting or anything. It's what the things he touches. And he actually, the one, you know, because the rest of us were sort of partying and hanging. It was a real boys movie. You know, we'd all go out shooting pool afterwards and hang out and stuff. And but De Niro didn't. And what he would do is he would go have dinner with an arson investigator, a different guy who was much smaller, and he would have dinner with his family and just kind of draw off him. And also, I think because he's a more quiet guy than the rest of us, it's kind of a big, loud cast, you know. But yeah, that's what he would do. So.
You mentioned
sorry, go ahead, please.
No, you mentioned it being a boys movie, and it definitely is, but I do want to ask you a question about the female characters in the script. Were they initially in the script?
Yes, always. Yeah.
Okay. And the romance storyline between Lee and Baldwin, was that in there as well? Or was that at all pushed by the film studio to get female audience members to watch this?
No, I don't remember anything really being pushed. I think if there was ever a choice to be made in Backdraft, because you got to remember the first cut of the movie was like 4 hours long. I mean, when we had our first assembly of the movie, it was like, oh, this is a really long movie. And when the decision was, so we'd shot a ton of stuff. We shot like 3 million feet of film. I think Hunt for Red October, for instance, I think shot 1 million feet of film. And we had to kind of cut the movie down. And the decision was, what is this movie really about? And I had always advocated that I really wanted it to be like a Silence of the Lambs arson story. Like that's the story I really wanted to tell. And I think Ron decided that, and I think he was right, emotionally it was a brother's story. And so a lot of the arson investigation kind of started to get cut out. And that left to a focusing more maybe on the relationship, the romantic relationship, and certainly between Billy and Kurt Russell. But it had all been shot. It was all there. It wasn't like they went back and shot any new stuff. But that became a focus through the editing process. Because, you know, I don't know if people realize there's really 3 movies. The movie you write, the movie you shoot, the movie you edit. They're really 3 different movies. And that's where that movie kind of came together. It's still a long movie. It's over. I don't think 2 hours and 40 minutes or something. But but that's interesting. There's some scenes that when they were airing it on network television to fill out the hour, because they put commercials in, or to make it end on an even hour, they put back in scenes that weren't the theatrical version. And some of our scenes I really love. They're just kind of quiet scenes, and you know, some of those actually show up in the TV version of it. So. But that was all there when we went in. Yeah.
Okay. And the other question, I think you had answered this already, or you had at least mentioned it. Why didn't any of the actors wear the self-contained breathing apparatus on their face?
Yes. Yeah, you get a lot. I know a lot of the two biggest complaints I hear from firemen are, well, in a real fire, you wouldn't see anything. And I'm like, well, yeah, okay, that's a problem, right? So, you know, and because it's true. Most of the time when you crawl into a fire, it's just black, you know. And the other thing was, well, they're not wearing their breathing apparatus. And my kind of defense of that is that in Chicago at that time, there were a lot of guys that didn't. You know, they were still kind of a tough ass department then. But also part of it was see their faces. It's the same reason in Top Gun. You know, in real life, a fighter pilot, when the second he closes his canopy till he opens again, he's got his oxygen mask on. You watch Top Gun, they're always flipping it off, and you know, and because you want to see their face talking. So
yeah, you're paying for those
that's
faces. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, I think they kind of let that. That was just a, you know, it's not a. My thing about Backdraft is it's not a documentary on firefighting techniques, but it is.
Of course.
It is. But it is, I think, the closest a movie's gotten to making you feel like what it's in there, what it's like in there. And part of it is, and I kind of started to mention this before, but I never finished, was, you know, because of the lack of CGI, we just burned things over and over again. And so there's an organic nature to the fires in Backdraft that you just don't see in other productions. I watch things today, like, you know, television shows like Rescue Me and stuff, and they're still doing the same thing where they obviously have a flame bar hidden behind something, and they turn it up like something to be in your gas fireplace, and it's a yellow flame coming up, and that's the fire. But you know, we would build sets, and then we do them in these real places. So we would take very little of the film was done on a set, and the set was in Cicero, so right across the line in Cicero, essentially an old warehouse that roof had caved in on. But but most of it was shot in real locations, and we'd shoot in things like these enormous old printing buildings that were just, you know, 5 feet of concrete. They were just amazing. And we built a set, and then, you know, the tech guys would go in there and they'd spray rubber cement all over it, and then we'd go action, and they'd throw a match, and the thing would just burn. And then the fire department would put it out when we were done. And first time we did it, it got out of control. And I have home video of this shot of everyone panicking and fleeing out of the room, you know, because it's burning out of control. And we had a set catch fire. The final thing that takes place in the chemical factory, that was actually done on the stage, quote stage we built in a warehouse over the line in Cicero, and then that set caught fire. You know, like we were shooting. I mean, I look at that scene still, and I'm amazed. Where you have Kurt Russell. I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the other guy, the guy that's the bad guy. Thank you. Hanging from, you know, Kurt Russell's holding on to a thing. There's a wire going through them, so they can't literally fall. But you know, we painted them with rubber cement and lit them on fire. You know, they're burning. You know, you know, and then they, you know, they have to be put out with a hose on the end, and they got hot in those things, and there's things exploding around them. And it's just, I think that one of the reasons I think the film still kind of works on that level is that we just burned real things over and over again, you know. And you can always kind of, I think an audience feels with CGI fires that are not quite real.
Yeah. It's still super impressive. It's like going back and watching Die Hards and all of those movies too.
Yeah.
It's very impressive to watch that before CGI sort of came to overtake everything.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I so many things going on. I was thinking about, you know, the makeup artists back in the day, the Tom Savinis of the world who would create these creatures, and now, you know, that's kind of a lost art. I was thinking about the sound design for the film. Now that I've kind of upgraded my system over the years, and I have a 4K version of Backdraft, and just the sound that it makes when the guy walks up to his door. And, you know, there's that just so great, you know, it's so very cool.
That part of it was really fun for me, because that was one of the things that Ron kind of wanted me to give my 2 cents of what things should sound like. So he actually set me up to Industrial Light and Magic, the ranch, they call it, you know, Lucas's ranch up outside in Marin County. I stayed there for a couple of days, and they have these beautiful little guest houses. And I would go in there and I would just talk to the sound cutters about, you know, you want shattering glass, you want, like, it needs to be noisy. It's not just burning, it's like wood exploding and things falling. It's just, incredibly noisy environments, and I worked with them on that. And then they had a problem with there were a couple moments in the film where I just made the sound because they couldn't do the sounds. It's actually my voice, like when the body groans and they rolled over, that's me. And because I had heard that sound before, rolling a body over.
Like the autopsy thing, the autopsy part?
Yeah, when it goes, yeah, that's me. And there's another one, some sound, I can't remember, it's some event sound, and I think I did some version of it's in the movie, you know. But yeah, so, but it was fun. But there was a lot of sound design on it, yeah, for sure.
So Michael Winslow from Police Academy should have been watching his back at that point. Your amazing sound effects from the 80s.
Yeah, exactly.
So, you know, we mentioned De Niro. You guys are shooting right around the time that Goodfellas came out, and obviously, I mean, he's Robert De Niro, so you know. But Goodfellas comes out, sends him to a new stratosphere. You've got him in your movie as, you know, the Rimgale character. Which, by the way, you mentioned the smoking thing. The first thing De Niro does, as you know, of course, he gets out of the car, kind of looks at the guy who's gotten blown through the windshield and lights up his cigarette, which I remember seeing in the theater. Like, it's like seeing doctors smoke. It just seems like, what are you doing there? Was the character, he comes across as really kind of like angry. Was the character written angry, or was that kind of De Niro's take on it?
Boy, I'm trying to remember now. I mean, I think the character always had an edge, for sure. And he's always meant to be a little weird. You know, he's the weird magician in the movie. And I think that's a good question. You know, and he obviously taunts Billy a little bit and pushes him around a little bit. So I guess so, but I know it's funny. I'm trying to remember exactly if that was
just
he
something
really
came
amped
to
that
mind.
up or not. Yeah, but I remember we all went and saw Goodfellas when it came out, because we were actually there. Cool. It was before Robert De Niro only worked on the movie for a month out of the 6 months. We concentrated all this stuff into 1 month, and so we were actually been working a bit when it came out, and so we actually all went and saw it.
Wow, that's super cool. Yeah, I love the Rimgale thing. I actually wrote here, I wasn't going to mention it just because it seems silly, but I want to commend you on some of the name choices, because it's really as though you went through a Chicago phone book at the time. So J.T. Walsh as Alderman Swayzak, which is a great Chicago name. Of course, the Irish firefighting family, the McCaffrey brothers, great Chicago. But then again, Jason Gedrick as Tim Krasminski, like, you know, you really have to kind of drill down to get a name like Krasminski, which isn't even easy to say. And I grew up here, so anyway.
They're all real people too that I knew there and stuff like that. And some of them, you know, the McCaffreys, I can't remember what the original name was. It was an Irish name, but I think we had to come up with a different one because the people who their job is to tell you, oh, there's a real person named that who might sue you because they have the same job or something.
Right.
It was that name actually, what I can't even remember what the original name was, or the original brother's name was, but that had to be changed. So it became, I think Ron picked McCaffrey. He might have picked McCaffrey, Ron Howard, but the other ones are all mine. Yeah, I really enjoyed it. It's a funny thing about Alderman Swayzak was originally he might have been the mayor or a member or the fire chief, the character. And the Chicago Fire Department, which was amazing on this, they basically let us do anything and gave us what we wanted. They were like, you know, fire department guys, I don't know. And I said, well, what if he's an alderman? They go, oh yeah, that's fine.
Corrupt alderman fits. Corrupt alderman fits right in with Chicago history. No problem. So that is spot on.
So, that was funny about that. But they were amazingly helpful. I mean, they really enjoyed that we were doing it, and they gave us a bunch of equipment. And you know, we bought an old surplus truck company from them that we rolled over, you know, to see what flips. And I did one. Do that with one, and so that was really fun. And we shot, you know, again, 99% of that movie's on location. You know, the fire station that they work in is a real fire station that we shot in down on the south side, and at least we used 2 different fire stations for different parts of it, but the main front of it and the main the apparatus floor is a real station. You know, they're really helpful. It's great.
Yeah, so you mentioned how the Chicago Fire Department was working with you with this movie. And I think of Top Gun and the military, of course, working with that movie. And in 1986 and the year or so that followed, there's this famous, Top Gun famously led to this military recruitment boom, right? Do you know if Backdraft had any sort of similar effect on firefighting?
I don't know if I've ever met anyone who said they joined the fire department because of Backdraft. I don't know. Because the problem with the fire department is it's always been an incredibly competitive job. You know, if you're not interested in the fire department or it's not on your radar, it might seem strange. But, the joke about what's the difference between a policeman and a fireman, the policeman's name didn't come up fast enough on the fire department list, it's always been, even back, it's even more so now because the pay is so much better, and it's actually, despite 9/11, a much safer job than it was. Both your likelihood of being killed instantaneously and your likelihood of dying later of a cancer, lung disease or something. The equipment is so much better and the safety is so much better, and our fire loads are less. I mean, generally speaking, there's half as many fires now as there was when we shot Backdraft, and so in America. So it's a much safer job and very well paid. So but even then, it was always a job that, if you had 10 openings, 5,000 people would apply. So it's kind of hard to judge. It's not like they ever had to go out looking for people to be firemen.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And speaking of action movies like Top Gun, I mean, were you a fan of other 1980s Chicago-based action movies at the time, like Thief or Above the Law?
Not those two. Well, I like Thief. I was more, I would say more The Untouchables.
Oh, yeah.
That would be more, because I like historical Chicago, and I felt like The Untouchables was out in Chicago a lot, and like Backdraft was all over Chicago. Like when we shot in people's apartments, there were people's apartment, people's houses. Every once in a while we go to the suburbs. I mean, I think we were in a suburb when there's a guy trying to light a plug that's burning, and and De Niro catches him, and there's a struggle. That was in somebody's real house out in the suburbs, and when they fall down an elevator shaft, and there's water at the bottom, burning elevator shaft. That was in a swimming pool in Oak Park. We built an elevator shaft in a swimming pool, but we were just out in the city constantly, and so much was kind of really interesting and fun. It was a nice way to see the city, and our lunches would, they'd pick a local bar and clear out a corner of it, and that's where we would have lunch. They'd set up tables there, and so we'd see all these crazy Irish bars on Milwaukee Avenue and stuff, and so it was fun. It was fun.
It's funny when we talk about practical special effects, and you see the number of movies where they go, well, they shot in Chicago, but it was all on a soundstage. Like, I love to hear, I mean, obviously what you guys were doing, you were out and about and you had to use buildings and you had to burn stuff. Like, I think that really adds a lot. You mentioned Rescue 911 earlier. When you see
Rescue Me.
Rescue. Oh, right.
I haven't actually seen Rescue 911.
Well, so I was going to say, I mean, you're obviously familiar with the different, Chicago Fire and Rescue Me and stuff like that. Do you ever think to yourself, like, man, I kind of helped set the pace for these shows, or were you just kind of, like?
It's a funny thing. It's kind of come full circle, because when I went out and was pitching Backdraft, because I pitched Backdraft to a studio, and it was the worst pitch of my life. I made every mistake you could make in a pitch, and I was saying things like, "Oh, I forgot the part where," just like it was terrible. It was so bad that I kind of just relaxed, because I figured, well, I've blown this, And at the end of it, the person doing the pitch just kind of made me stop, like, stop. And I'm like, what? I just kind of stopped, and they go, "Does he live?" And I go, "What do you mean? The main character, does he live?" I go, "Yeah." And they go, "It's a good thing this is such a wonderful story, because you're a terrible pitcher. We'll call your agent in the morning. We're buying it." So they wanted to buy it. They just wanted me to shut up.
Wow.
But the I forgot what I was going with that. What was the question about the?
Whether you feel like you kind of set the pace for these.
Oh yeah. So
shows.
One of the problems I had prior to that person buying it at that studio was I'd mentioned this idea, and they go, "Fireman, that's TV," because it was emergency to them. And so then once it became a movie, then I think that idea of a drama set in a firehouse, which really hadn't been done before, maybe that opened the door to a bunch of stuff. I don't know if you could really call Chicago Fire a drama, but it's I think it opened up certainly for stuff like Rescue Me, I think, and things. I would say, yeah. which
Yeah.
I'm a big fan of SQB, even though I was dissing their special effects. You know, I do like the show.
Yeah. I love that you mentioned Emergency. When I was a kid, we're, you know, just a couple of years apart, but loved Emergency as a kid, big Randolph Mantooth and Kevin
Right,
Todd
right.
fan. And that was really one of those things. Like when I was a kid, I was like, oh my gosh, this is the coolest thing in the world, like to do what they do. And, you know, so it's kind of nice that there was a nod, you know, to that.
Yeah. Totally. Yeah.
So critics were a little rough on your script. Were you able to brush that off? I mean, you were working with Ron Howard and all these amazing people, and I imagine the big paycheck helped, but it had to sting a little bit.
You know, it was actually more the ones you cared about, like the New York Times and the LA Times, were rough on it. They're rough on the movie in general. But a lot of other reviews were fine, and over time, it's looked back on and much more happily. So, you know, I always have a joke that whenever my hometown newspaper would show up on the doorstep, it was always a bad review of any movie I did, even the very, very successful ones. And I got a really good review for The Prophecy, but I think it was because the guy was on vacation. Somebody else reviewed it.
They got a stringer. They got a stringer to be nice to you.
Yeah, so it was like, you know, I think at the time, maybe for 5 seconds, but you know, after that, it was just because it was a very successful movie and people liked it, and it got a lot of love, and so I didn't, you know, we just kind of roll off a little bit, I guess.
Well, when is the last time that you actually watched the movie in full, and what do you think? I mean, you've mentioned that it still holds up. Is that sort of your, you know, the way that you think of it now?
Wait, say again. I'm sorry, the first half got cut off.
When was the last time that you actually watched the movie in full?
It's been a long time. You know, it's funny. I caught it on. There was a television series with Julia Roberts, who played a psychologist in some sort of reentry group. I forgot the name of the show, but she's watching Backdraft. Yeah, she's watching Backdraft in her apartment.
Oh wow!
But which I thought was funny. But I haven't watched the whole movie probably in forever. You know, the problem with doing a movie, I watch very few movies of mine really ever. If it pops on TV, I'll watch 10 minutes of it. You know, something I've done. But I think the problem is that if you actually make a movie, all you see is the things you wish you could change. You know, it's hard to see the movie as a separate thing. You also see it as the experience you had making it. You also see it, all the things that got cut out that you wish were in there. But because they were cut out, of course, they must have been perfect because you never had to live with them in it. So you have these fantasy, amazing scenes that, you know, the critics would have loved it if we just kept that in, you know. And you know, and so it's just it's kind of a torturous experience because all you keep thinking was like, you know, there was a better version of that, or there was this or that, or whatever opinions you have, you know. And so it's hard to look at it as in any way like a actual viewer of the movie would look at it.
Of course, yeah.
So
well, what for Backdraft 2, how was that revisiting the characters and then creating new ones for the script for that movie?
That was, you know, I really enjoyed writing the script. The movie didn't come out very well, I don't think, because it had a budget of like $4 million. It was a tiny little movie, and they shot in Romania, and so it was. It wasn't a really happy experience for me, but I couldn't imagine somebody else writing it, so I wrote it. And they, unfortunately, because of the budget, and I wasn't on the set, when they run out of money, they just cut pages randomly out of it. So I don't think it makes any sense, and you know. But it was a nice. Yeah, I enjoyed the idea of going back to it. You know, and it's a world. So I always regretted it because the reason I did it now comes, I wonder if I should have, but the reason I did it was because I turned down doing the Highlander sequels, and those were terrible. And I kind of wished I had done them now, you know, just because I care about the story and the characters, and
right.
You know, maybe Highlander 2 would have been better, you know. If I mean, it was hard because I got a big check for them doing Highlander 2 as well as getting a check for Backdraft 2, but and I thought that was enough. But then when the movie was awful, Highlander 2, I thought, maybe I should have, you know, done something about it. So I didn't want to make that mistake with Backdraft 2, but then it was such a tiny little budget. It was such a not taken seriously by that division of Universal that, you know, maybe I shouldn't have done it. But I don't know, whatever. Like, you just move on.
Right.
Well, like you said, it's you know, the movie you want to make, the movie make, and then editing.
Yeah.
It sounds like that was one of those things, like, you know, it was going to be direct to video. Your hands were kind of tied, like all you can do is the best you can. I thought Donald Sutherland was great. I mean, I'm really glad
He
that
was
that
great.
character
Yeah.
made it. I'm glad Billy Baldwin showed up for a couple
Yeah.
scenes.
It was fun that they did it. Yeah, you know, there's definitely moments in it, and there's dialogue in it where I go, oh, yeah, okay, they kept that scene. You know,
Well,
that's good. You know,
you said something earlier that made me think of Backdraft 2, where I think you know, the main character says something like you know, to the assistant, or you know, his new partner, like, you know what you're doing, right? And she goes, let me guess, fire bad.
yeah,
And
yeah,
you go,
yeah.
yeah, okay. And I was like, oh, that's really funny. Like, you know, anyway, I thought
Yeah,
it was,
there's some good bits in it. And when he talks about how he's not a very good fireman because he's not one of the boys, you know, like I really like that. Like there's some nice runs in it that go well. The problem I basically have with it, and I think because if you're a screenwriter, as much as you love the dialogue you write, you're really in it for the structure of the film, because that's what makes a film work, is the structure. And there's a lot of structure that was just yanked out of it for budget reasons. Like, you know, I mean, I remember the first scene in the movie is somebody comes walking out of a house and closes the door, and then it blows up 5 minutes later when kids come up. And I'm like, well, that's not how a backdraft works. That's a bomb.
yeah.
And that's not the way it was written. You know,
Oh,
it's
boy.
like, oh, so you're doing this, and you go, oh man, so, whatever. I could be shoveling coal for a living. So.
Well, so you mentioned the, you know, the acts of the story. Kelly had a question earlier that I don't think we got to. Do you tend to write in a linear fashion, or like what part with Backdraft, what part of the 3-act structure did you come up with first?
Well, when you say linear, I mean, I start at the beginning and go to the end. I don't write it in chunks. Definitely. I've always been that kind of writer. When you say the storyline, I mean, I usually think that to feel comfortable starting a story and not just end up in a dead end, at least for me, you need the little story you want to tell. Oh, what is this movie really about? I want to tell a story about, you know, blah, blah, blah. And then you think, well, where's a nice place to set it? You know, like, where is a good setting for this story? And then it's like, okay, well, what makes the people interesting in terms of what they want in the story? And if you think about it, those are three very separate things in Backdraft, you know. And I don't think Backdraft would have been as good if it was in the LA Fire Department. For one thing, the AQMD would never let us burn as much as we did, you know. So, you know, but one reason we didn't do it now. And you know, I think that made a big difference. I think, you know, ultimately it was a brother's story. I think that was what the characters wanted, you know, was about this relationship. And then that kind of fit in with this nice little notion of an arson investigation story that's a little close to home, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. And I think that those things kind of have to all be there before you start, really. So, because if you only have one of them, I mean, I have a million ideas, and sometimes you have one of those and it goes in a drawer until something inspires you to have two of those. Then hopefully you get a third, and then you write it. Or
it all starts clicking. Yeah.
Hopefully. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad, obviously, that you set Backdraft in Chicago. I mean, Chicago truly, yes, Los Angeles has had some horrible fires, but you know, Chicago is a city defined by fire, and so to have a firefighting movie elsewhere, I mean, it would just seem like, you know, what, you know, why would you do that?
Yeah. Well, it just worked for a lot of reasons. It was it was it made a lot of sense. I'm glad we did it, because it hadn't been shot out. Like, no one had done the Chicago Fire Department, you know, like New York came up, but New York Fire Department, you know, you'd seen and people are familiar with it. And, you know, I just kind of thought, you know, Chicago was just different, you know, and it was kind of a random choice. I didn't have family. Well, I have an ancestor that played for the Chicago Bears, but
wow,
Bill Wyken in the 50s. But he was actually from Cleveland, though. But you know, I didn't really have any connection to it. I just kind of thought that's an interesting city, and I'd like to go. And so,
but it was also a good time to be filming in Chicago too, after the Blues Brothers. You know, when Chicago opened back up for filming purposes, so you got in there, of course, at a really great time for that.
Yeah, they were, you know, and it was a nice mixture of a city that was big enough and developed enough and wealthy enough, and, you know, infrastructure enough that they could do this movie,
Right.
But at the same time, it felt like a small town because, you know, we were kind of the only big movie there. There wasn't like shooting in Toronto now where there's 9 movies shooting, you know, it was just us. And so like, you know, the mayor gave us a private tour of a Monet exhibit they had, kind of closed the museum for us. You know, like stuff like that would happen
Right.
all the time. And so you kind of, in some way, you kind of felt you were in a small town, but in other ways, obviously, you were in this enormous city and all that stuff. So
Yeah. Had you been here about 15 years earlier, you wouldn't have gotten that tour probably.
Oh, really? Was it totally different? You know, when I actually did my first trip to Chicago, Mayor Byrne, I think, had just been defeated. So that was
She
there
was
was a
the
lot of
one
ruckus.
that opened
Or maybe it was
everything
Washington. Did Washington come after Byrne?
up.
Or was Washington before Byrne?
Washington, oh boy, now I'm drawing a blank. Washington would have been 82, so he would have been after Byrne.
After Byrne, yeah.
So I guess it was right after Washington had left is when I went there. I think it was but I remember everyone was talking about Byrne, and you know, because I think she didn't have a very good relationship with the fire department. But so there was a lot of talk around the fire department tables about Byrne.
Now I'm doubting my my mayoral time. Yeah. So what? Famously, the first Mayor Daley was not a big fan of filmmakers shooting in Chicago. There was a kind of a bad experience after the Democratic upheaval in 1968, and he basically said like nothing gets filmed here anymore, and it was that way for a very long time. So yeah, I mean, opened up, and John Hughes kind of brought things back, and you know, you guys and everything else that came after it. So
yeah, it was kind of a nice window too, because it was still an era when you could choose to shoot in a city that was that had the look you wanted and was cooperative. You didn't have to factor in tax deals.
Yeah.
And so now, you know, 90% of the movies that are set in Chicago are shot in Toronto because of the tax deals, you know. And the Backdraft 2 was shot in Romania of all places, but because there were, well, cheap labor, but also tax deals, you know. And they shot it a couple of days running around Chicago for some, you know, street stuff. But you know, and I think that back then it was just, oh, Chicago is cooperative and looks right, we'll just do it here, you know, and you didn't have to factor in that other element. Like I imagine it must be harder now to make the case to shoot movies in Chicago, unless there's a tax. I mean, I guess Chicago Fire got a tax deal of some kind, I think, and I think that's why they're there. But you know, it's harder now, you know, to do that.
Is it 30% tax breaks now? I think.
For Chicago, is it 30?
I think that's right, and then a little bit more maybe for diversity projects.
Okay.
I think I have to check my files, but I think that.
Okay, I'm probably out of date in what I'm saying, but
no.
Yeah.
But it is funny the number of things that I see that come up with the Georgia Film Commission, you know, at the end. I think, oh my gosh, everything films in Georgia these days.
Well, you know, part of the problem is, and just might be off the beam of what you want to talk about here, but you know, one of the things that is interesting is one of the dangers for places like Los Angeles is that a place like Georgia has a tax deal for so long that you end up with a lot of infrastructure there, and you end up with a lot of technicians and artists that relocate there. And then even if the tax deal isn't as good later on, or say California makes a competitive tax deal, or Chicago, there's still an impetus to go to Atlanta because all the stuff's there now.
Yeah,
because they've had that deal long. Like a place like New Orleans didn't have the deal long enough to have that, you know, because but Atlanta really went all in, and so they've actually created a kind of competitive infrastructure there that, you know, isn't as dependent on tax now because a lot of stuff is there.
Yeah,
it still is to some extent, you know, because you know, especially because politically a lot of people have issues with Georgia right now, but it's interesting though, you know, that certainly happened with Canada, you know, where there's so much infrastructure now in places like Vancouver and Toronto, especially for television, that in itself becomes an attraction now because they can do it, you know.
Yeah. Vancouver, Hollywood North, you know, like
totally.
it's already there. Like, let's just go. So back to Backdraft, you know, box office success. Last I checked, it's currently in the mid 70s with critics and with the audience on Rotten Tomatoes. there was a Universal Studios Hollywood
Yeah.
tour attraction for 20, nearly 20 years. There's still one in Japan. It's got to be a little bonkers to you to know that your vision, your writing helped create all that, right?
Yeah, I mean, you're always a little divorced from it mentally, because it's a collaborative business. But on the ride, they actually say my name. Ron Howard says my name on the ride if you go on it. But so my family always cheers. But I think, yeah, I mean, it's less weird than Highlander, because Highlander, it was the first script I wrote, and I was a 20-year-old college student, in a screenwriting class, and suddenly I was on the set in Scotland with the AD going, who are you? And I'm going, I'm the writer. And he goes, you mean you ride the horses? Because I look like I'm 10 and I've got a UCLA sweatshirt. And I'm like, no, I'm the writer. Backdraft is not as weird because I'd already made a movie or two. I'd done some television movies after Highlander, and I'd done some other stuff and written movies that didn't get made for big studios. And I'd kind of been in the business. And so it wasn't as perfectly strange. And I had that connection to it because having been in the fire department. So, Highlander was weirder, I would say, than Backdraft. It's also much more, the fans are much more rabid. I meet people every day that love Backdraft. I meet people every day who Highlander is their favorite movie ever. So
Yeah.
But so it's a weirder thing with that. It's like,
Yeah.
I was just a kid when I wrote that. I don't even remember what I was doing. But Backdraft, I was much more, and also in a weird way with Backdraft, I was much more involved in it. I felt more participatory in it because I was on the set the whole time. I was actually engaged in rewriting on the set and talking to the actors. I was involved in the post. Ron invited me out to where he was cutting it in Connecticut, and I'd watch cuts of it and make suggestions. I went to all the audience test screenings. I went, like I said, I even supervised some of the looping of the actors, the main actors, and and did some of the post sound. And so I kind of felt a stronger participant in the movie than maybe a lot of writers would normally feel.
Well, I wish Highlander had more of a Chicago connection, because I could do hours on Highlander, and it would get embarrassing for everybody. But for men of a certain age,
Sure.
Highlander is top notch. So, in addition to creating successful film franchises like Backdraft, The Prophecy, obviously Highlander, and others, you published a novel a few years back called Blood Makes Noise. Yeah, tell us about that.
I just wanted to write a book. My screenplays tend to get complimented for their the descriptions in them and the writing in them, which of course no one will ever see because they're only made for the people that make the movie. And I kind of thought, well, it'd be nice to put that. I just like writing, and I wanted to write a novel, and so I did. And it's based on a true story, and it's a crazy story, and it was fun researching it, going down to Argentina and doing a drive across Europe that I had to do for it. And it was fun, and it did well. It sold, and the publisher did well by it, and it's a happy story. So.
And do you have another book in the works, kind of backburnered for now? Or?
Yeah, I have an arson investigation book that I want to do. I keep getting slowed down. I'm doing a movie at Warner Brothers right now with Margot Robbie that will not be shot in Chicago since it takes place in 9th century Rome. But it's hard, writing books is, unless you're Stephen King, and unless you're a machine that can churn them out, which I can't, it takes me a long time to write a book. It's just hard because, the amount of money that you're likely to get from writing a book compared to the amount of money you get writing for a movie that never gets made isn't even comparable. Like they're so enormous. So if you have to support a family, or it's really hard sometimes to not do the screenwriting all the time, even though maybe on some level you'd rather be writing the book, but it's hard.
So looking back, would you say that screenwriting was a better choice for a career than firefighting?
Yeah, I was never always, let me put it correctly. I was a weird fireman. Because I was a fireman in a transition period where there were still guys on the job that they could have done this or worked for the sanitation department. Like they had a test, and it was very competitive, but the tests related to, you know, how good you were with hands and mechanics, and, you know, they used to fix the trucks themselves back then, you know, and I was never one of those guys. I didn't fit in at all. They all did construction on their days off. They built decks for people and things, and I was terrible at that. You know, I was studying, I was going to college and getting a master's degree, and I was just a weird guy. That's not true now, I think, because it's such a high paid job now that, you know, there's MBAs that are firemen, but at least in LA, you know. I was also different in that I really loved the transition to paramedics, and most firemen in the era I did it hated it, because it, you know, suddenly they were running their asses off all day long, you know, doing medical aids when that wasn't really their mandate before. And particularly in LA, the firemen are the paramedics. It's the same unit, same people. You know, it's an additional bit of training for the guys that actually administer the medical care, but, you know, everybody's goes on a medical aid. And I loved that. It made me weird, you know, that side of it. And so I don't know if I necessarily fit in as well as I could have when I was there, but I actually, ironically though, I think I left it too early. You know, I had the option to go on film sets and do things, and I just thought, it's time to pull the plug. I'm clearly making a living at this other thing, but sometimes I miss it. You know, I particularly, not so much now, but when I was on the set of Backdraft, you know, I'd sit around with the real guys, you know, and there's some real firemen in the movie, you know, that I'd hang out with them on the set, and they, you know, the kitchen table of the actual fire station we were shooting, and we start telling firefighting stories. Stuff, and I kind of go, sort of, you know, because I'd only been out 6 or 7 years when I did Backdraft, so you know, it was I kind of missed it with them. You know, I was like, okay, maybe I left a little too early. You know, but.
And you don't see yourself maybe, you know, moving to a small town and joining the volunteer fire department at this point?
I don't live in a small town, so it's
you'd have to move. I mean, I'd have to help you pack up.
Yeah, I mean, that's a lot of hypotheticals on top of each other. But you know, I'd have to not live in Los Angeles. But
right.
So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I own a fire engine. You know, so I suppose I could take it out. A buddy of mine and I bought one. He's obsessed with fire department stuff, but has never been a fireman. But he found the fire engine that I worked on, and when I was a fireman, it was available as a surplus unit. And so he got me to go in on it. We bought it and dressed it up as it would have been when I worked on it, and we drive it around for a laugh. So we take it wine tasting and stuff.
So it's a little odd.
So I keep my fingers in it, I guess, you know?
Yeah.
And I know a lot of guys still in the department.
So fully restored and the whole bit, huh?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's fantastic.
I mean, fire engines usually last cities usually keep fire engines 20, 25 years, you know, and it was already, when I worked on it, it was already probably 12 years old, you know? So it was a 72 Crown, but it was kind of the ones that was back before they put roofs on them, you know, it was a convertible Crown, you know. It's a big fire. It looks like a real fire engine. It's not like a little, you know, steam engine or something. But it's but it's fun. Yeah, we run around, we pump it for kids and stuff. You
know. Kelly, what have I missed? Have we missed anything?
I don't think so. I think we've hit everything that I was interested in. I hope you have too.
Yeah. Anything else you want to share with the listeners and fans, Mr. Widen?
No, just I really loved Chicago. I had a great time, and I have a couple funny stories. When I went back to we finished shooting just after Thanksgiving, so it was starting to get cold, but it wasn't crazy cold. I went back to do the looping. We did the looping in Chicago, and I had to do that in February. And I'd never been in a city like Chicago in February. And I was staying in the hotel at that point, going back to the looping, the Delaware Hotel, I think. I was on Delaware Street. I don't know if that was Delaware Hotel. It was the Whitehall at that point. But there was a cafe called the Third Coast, which existed then, which was a real fun place I used to go and write all the time. And it was about a block and a half away. And I was used to in LA that, you know, no matter how cold it is, on the coldest day of the year, you can walk half a block and you're comfortable in a t-shirt, but you can do it. You know? And I don't know, it was minus 1 billion, you know, that day in Chicago. And I put on a t-shirt and I thought, well, I'll just walk the half block because it'll be hot. They always overheat the rooms in Chicago. So, you know, I thought like, I'll just walk down to the cafe in my t-shirt. And I think I got about half a block and I realized if I didn't turn around, I would die.
That sounds right.
Yeah.
I realized this was a terrible mistake, you know. so that was one of my Chicago experiences. But,
That's
but I had a
great.
great time. You know?
Yeah, it's great you mentioned Third Coast. There is still a Third Coast, and now I'm wondering whether it has been there 30 years or if this is just a different place that happened to take the name.
Well,
Third
there were
Coast.
two branches. There was one, boys, and so you can cut this part out, but there was one that was on Delaware Street that I know is gone because I think they might have torn the building down. But they or maybe it's not, but it's not there because I did walk. There was another one that was more towards the Gold Coast, closer to the water.
Yeah, so you went to the
that was the
Delaware
other
one, not the Gold Coast
Yeah,
one. Okay.
the Delaware one was the bigger one.
Okay.
And I used to go there all the time. And
Yeah.
you know, and I just because it was something really cozy because you know you have these shitty days and you'd sit in there and write and you're a little tired anyway from whatever nonsense everyone was up to the night before, so they're a little hungover and whatever, and you know it's snowing and you're writing, and it was just kind of for a person who grew up in Southern California beach town, it was kind of exotic and fun, you know. So.
I love the idea that anybody could look at Chicago and say exotic, I guess. But certainly compared to growing up in Laguna, that's pretty great. So
yeah.
Gregory Widen, thank you for your time. Continued success. This has been amazing.
Great. Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.